moving right along. So abolition, it didn't come easily, all right? Um, there's a whole heap of backlash. We know the abolition story with Oladao, O Equiano, and Wilberforce, and all of these people, okay? But what we don't recognize that there was a lot of backlash in Britain as well as in the United States for people um, to be not enslaved, all right? And a lot of this was pushed through negative racialized propaganda. Okay? One classic case in point is this cartoon that we see here. All right? This cartoon that we're seeing here, John Bull taking a clear view of the Negro slavery question. We see a whole heap of things. All right? For one thing, we see this guy here, okay, looking at a Caribbean island off the coast of England or wherever they are. Okay? But here we have an abolitionist pushing a picture of a slave being whipped in front of his telescope. You guys see that? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But notice the people on the island. Notice how they are cavorting. Yes, reveling. Some of them are fat. You know, having a grand time over here in the Caribbean. You see, right? So what it is you telling me? Really, you know, whatever you're telling me, you're pushing something in front of me so that all I could see is this, right? When in truth and in fact, everybody, you know, they're living off the hog over there in the Caribbean. Okay, so that was one thing. Okay, in this picture, another thing was this. So here we have a man and his family begging, right? He's asking, please do not think on Poor Pat. Poor Pat is one of his children, of course. Okay? So he's saying basically, okay, you all are focusing on abolition, but we have poor people here in England who you all are paying no attention to. Notice that nobody is focusing on this guy here. You see what I'm saying? And then on top of that now, this whole abolitionist movement was pushed through petitions. Okay? So they got this petition campaign and they got a whole heap of people signing these petitions. Check this out. Okay? In this case, right, what he's saying is that, you know, it's a lot of little children who signing this petition. You see, it is fake. Right? Not serious. Okay, so these are the kinds of things that, and there are many more things happening in this cartoon here. Okay, but this was the view of the anti-abolition people back then.
Roger,
yes,
can you speak to the impetus behind the anti-slavery movement at that time? I mean, who was really? Did they have like a religious conversion? I mean, they were making so much money in England, for example. What was
actually,
behind
there were two main reasons. Okay, one of which was, you know, the humanitarian, you know, stroke religious grounds. Okay, right? Because a lot of these guys at Wilberforce and others were very religious people. Okay, and they came into this process of abolition with that mindset, okay, that all of us, for want of a better word, are the same, you know, and this treatment just cannot stand, okay? So there was that. And then Equiano himself with his document, okay, was a major, you know, contributor to letting people know what is going on, okay? The second thing is that, and this is fundamentally so, okay, Europe and England in particular was moving into the industrial age. This plantation style story, okay, was agricultural that required a whole heap of people, right? But with industrialization going on in England, you don't need all of these people, okay? Right, firstly, and then secondly, right, sugar was becoming unprofitable. You see, right? So, you know, you had that tension going on as well. All right. So
I think, sorry,
go ahead.
I think the first and most important reason, right, is that there's man's inhumanity to man, but there's also man's humanity to man, right? And that brutality against others is actually revolting to the senses of many people, right? Which is why Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, struck such a chord in white people, right? Mind you, she made Uncle Tom a very docile person, right? And perhaps that was deliberate, right? Juxtaposed against a very cruel master, right? So you know, it's not that white people were motivated to end slavery on strictly for economic reasons. They were motivated to end slavery because of its sheer brutality against their fellow human beings.
Khalid, while I agree with that, I think if you read Dr. Eric Williams' thesis, Capitalism and Slavery,
I read it.
Where he documented, I think that, you know, as much as, you know, the abolitionists absolutely, I mean, essentially what you're talking about is the George Floyd effect, right? Where they saw a man getting killed live on TV,
right,
and it brought a whole lot of, right.
Yes.
And so there was that, but I think
Yes.
the failing, the fact that beet sugar was taking over as the source of sugar for Europe, and sugar in the Caribbean was becoming less and less profitable, right?
Yes.
Especially when they couldn't continue to replace slaves at that cheaper cost, because remember, the abolition of the slave trade came before the abolition of slavery. So that human capital that used to be coming all the time, now they had to deal with what they had on hand, right? And so it became more expensive to maintain slaves.
Of course.
You know, and so that was part of
yeah,
you know,
100%. And I'm not dismissing it at all. I'm not. Which I said first and foremost. I didn't say first and only, right? I'm not dismissing the economic factor at all, right? And it's interesting that you pointed out the abolition of the slave trade came before the abolition of slavery itself. Why did they abolish the slave trade, right? Because I mean, you know, and the connection between people tend to think of the abolitionist movement as being birthed and taking rise in Europe, which is not entirely true. The abolitionist movement worked hand in hand with Africans working against the slave trade in Africa, which were before and they were aware of, right?
Yeah.
So it was a combination of Africans working against the trade in Africa, and then Wilberforce Sunday in Europe lobbying against it as well, right?
Yeah.
You know, but for sure, the economic factor is a consideration, right? But there's a reason why. The slave owners, for example, you know, work so hard to spread the propaganda that Black people are just barely above those of animals, which is why we treat them a particular way, right? Because it was a sell to the average white man or white woman who would look at this brutality and think, this is wrong, right? This is wrong. So they had to sell that propaganda, right? You read where people from Europe, like Alexis de Tocqueville, for example, right, came to America and remarked on how uncivilized and barbaric American white people were for having this institution.
Yeah.
You know, it did speak to the humanity of people.
Yeah, and more than that, you know, in the U.S., and it's something you could look at, you know, the propaganda that preceded the abolition of slavery in the United States, which came about, you know, 3 decades after the British West Indies and so on, was as vicious or even more vicious, right? You know, with Sambo and all of these different types of characterization.
right? That was a sell.
Yeah.
Okay, not for us black people, but that was a sell to white people. You know, to convince them that that we needed to keep your fellow man in this condition.
Yeah.
Yeah, listen, and the cell continues.
Yeah.
And the cell
So,
continues.
So guys, let me bring this home. Right?
Roger, let me just ask a question, since
certainly.
Arthur and Khalid are making some input here. This is a crucial point, because for people like myself, looking in from the outside, I see the economic reason for the people who are the power mongers in this story as being much stronger than man's humanity to man.
So Denison, we're coming to that now, actually. Okay, because what I'm gonna explain to you guys now, okay, is that you may not have thought about it, but it's something to pay attention to, and it is this. Okay, compensation was paid to the slaveholders for the abolition of slavery. Okay, so when the pro-British people realized that there was a lost cause fighting against abolition, they demanded compensation for the loss of their property. So this question, Khalid, okay, about, all of us are equal human beings and so on, okay? The abolitionists who were fighting that fight now had to concede, okay, that, you know what, if you're going to get abolition, okay, we have to compensate these people, thereby recognizing people as property. You see what I'm saying? Right? So it was a major concession that the abolitionists had to make so that they could push the abolition act through.
What we're looking at here, and we see it even today, right? Is that money is power.
Yeah,
right?
money talk.
Money is power. And we see that in provincial politics, right? We see to whom the politicians are beholden, right? In terms of with regard to Denison's comment, right? Man's humanity to man does win out in the end eventually, right? It does win out in the end eventually. For a long time, this power structure may hold, right? But I mean, we have seen in our own lifetime, we've seen the most vicious fascist regimes topple, right? Just based upon people's resistance, right? We saw it in the Philippines with Marcos. We saw it with the Shah and so on. What replaces it may be question, right? But we see people's resistance to this power all the time, right? We see it with in the United States, textile workers, right? In the early part of the 20th century, we see how unions have risen up. We see it all the time.
I agree with you, that the toil is just very slow. It's slow but sure, right?
Yeah.
Because the point that Roger just made is the same thing happened in the US after the Civil War. Reparations were paid to the slave owners as well.
Yeah.
In this country, you have this argument about reparations until somebody pointed out that reparations were paid. It was paid.
So let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about that, because they set up a committee called the Slave Compensation Commission, okay, to deal with repaying these people for loss of their property. All right, and in 1834, okay, the British Parliament passed this Slave Abolition Act in 1833, actually. Okay, you can find a copy of it, a PDF, version of it somewhere on the internet. All right. But what happened was that this act here repealed the Barbados slave codes that I talked about. Right? Remember, the Barbados slave codes were done in 1660. Okay, so we're talking almost 200 years. All right, before it was repealed. All right. So, you know, for African people on the plantations in the Caribbean, they didn't know anything about this really. Okay. And as Sparrow say, one day somebody just say, free the slaves. Yes. And freedom came. Okay. No work, no particular skill, nothing. No land, no nothing. Okay. Anyhow, so let's go on. All right. So what this slave compensation committee set up, commission, okay, came up with really was a standard set of rules for compensating all of these slave owners. Okay. Now nothing like this ever existed before within Britain. Okay. Remember, we're talking about plantation owners who consider themselves very privileged, okay, and accustomed to their own rules. All right. So all of a sudden, the British government is imposing on you how much you are getting systematically. It doesn't matter if you are one little woman living in London or a big plantation owner having thousands of people in Jamaica and Barbados. Everybody getting the same money. Yes. So this is, again, you can check the London Gazette of 1834. Again, a PDF that is there. Right? But this here was published announcing the work of the commission. All right, so if you are a slave owner, you wanted to get your hands on this because it describes how much you're going to get for each person. Okay, and in fact, they set up on page 696, okay, this form here, okay, where you had to fill out, okay, by way of name and so on and so forth, who are the head people, who are the tradesmen, who are the inferior tradesmen, and so on and so forth. And depending, if you had 6 people, okay, you had to list their names and so on, their age, and people were paid accordingly, regardless of whether you are one little woman living somewhere on, you know, High Street in London, or you are like Thistlewood in Jamaica. You see what I'm saying? Okay. All right. So these things actually happen. All right. And the thing about it, so who got what? Check this out. At the time, they paid out 17 million pounds in 1830 something, which is equivalent to 20 billion pounds in today's money. All right. To British slave owners. The 46,000 of them ended up with 20 billion pounds in today's money. Okay? Plus, you know, plus on top of that, okay, the people who they had to provide an apprenticeship for no pay. Okay? So if you were a domestic worker, you had to provide 4 years of free service. If you were a field worker, you had to provide 6 years of free service, right? Before you can, you know, move off the plantation. All right. So what did African people get? $0 in compensation, nothing. Yes. Okay. Regardless of all the kidnapping and the forced marches and the torture and the forced labor and the pain and suffering and death that was suffered for these hundreds of years, they got nothing. Yes? So now when you hear men talking about reparation, you got to put that into context. All right? Okay? All right? Because, you know, if you think about, and I always say this whole business about African slavery in the history of mankind, really, okay? You know, it's probably the worst episode of genocide and human brutality. Okay, right? You know, if you look at Hitler and the Jewish question, that only lasted for about, what, 4 to 6 years? You know, this whole thing lasted for over, you know, 250, almost 300 years. Okay? I guess, you know, the people the indigenous people in the Caribbean, they only lasted about 50 years. You know, but anyways, so So this is it, and of course Emancipation Day.
Roger. I just want to say something. What you just said about the indigenous people maybe seen as quite offensive to indigenous people, because it didn't just last for 50-something years, right? It was a wipeout. We survived and we kept coming, but there was no keeping coming for them. You see what I'm saying? Theirs was a wipeout. So it may have been 50-something years.
Okay. Maybe it's how I said it, right?
It's 50 years it took to wipe them out, bro.
To wipe them out. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, we can't compare one to the other, man.
No, well, one
I don't think there's a need to compare one to the other.
Well, I'm just making the point that,
slavery lasted a long time.
It lasted a long time,
It was an enduring process, but there's no comparison.
Yeah, my thing, Khalid, is that what would have happened if it did not stop?
No, I'm just saying that it's not a matter of comparing brutalities, right? Especially about the genocide of our people, because at one time we had millions of people, indigenous people in the Americas.
Oh yes. Of course, I made that point last week.
For them to die, right?
Yeah. I'm not really comparing people. I'm just,
Yeah, I'm just saying how it came across.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So emancipation. What you may not have known is that Trinidad and Tobago is the first country in the world to declare Emancipation Day. Right? All these fellas in NJAC and so on who pushed Emancipation Day went to the Swedish king and so on and so forth.